And we'll do a quick recap as we look at this book, and I believe this book speaks to our time and to our generation, right? And we see in chapter 1, right? And we see that Habakkuk has this dialogue with God in which he is surrounded by evil. The King James says in chapter 1 that evil doth compass the righteous. Right? Doth compass every which way that Habakkuk turns, there is evil. And we also see that God saves. And I believe we have to realize that just as Habakkuk today, we live in a society, we live in a culture that is underpinned by a world system that is in rebellion to God and led ultimately by the ultimate and foremost rebeller to God, Satan, right? And so we live in this culture, and evil's all around us. If a Christian does not believe they live in an evil culture, they have their head in the sand. Truly. But we know that God saves. God tells Habakkuk that the judgment is coming, that the Babylonians, the Chaldeans are going to come, and they're going to run through the land of Judah. They are going to conquer Judah. And we know this is played out in the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the exile. And we see it in chapter 1, the end of chapter 1, the beginning of chapter 2, that Habakkuk 1 focuses on the holiness of God. And then he puts himself in a position to hear from God. And all too often, the reason I love this book, I loved it for the time that we're in right now, is because all too often today churches have become quasi-political action committees, right? The church has become convinced that a political party or a political figure is going to save them. It's false. God saves. The government will save us. False. God saves. And we looked at that, and we looked at chapter 2, in which Habakkuk struggled to understand because he was seeing where his feet are, and he wondered how God would use the Chaldeans to punish who he thought was less evil, right? And we get in this tier system. We have to look at the purpose of the church, and the purpose of the church is we are above anyone. It's not a good behavior club. It's not a self-help. It's not a self-help seminar on Sunday mornings, right? It's only through the blood of Christ that we become set apart from the world. And God continues to hammer in the end of chapter 2, right? All the idols are fallen. All the idols are broken. People ask them to speak, and they're mute because they're dead. But the living God is in his temple. And it's speaking to us today that all of these things are going to pass away. Empires will rise and fall. Governments come and go. Banks will rise and collapse. All of these things will pass away. And all too often the church will be focused solely on the temporal, and they will lose sight of the eternal. Now, don't take this to mean that you don't have to pay your electricity bill because you're looking into eternity. You call Duke and tell them that, they might have an issue. But I'm telling you, but the thing is we have to walk as Habakkuk is being told to in his book when he's talking with God, and that while he walks today, he's looking into eternity. Because is that not what we do as Christians? Through the blood of Christ, we're guaranteed life eternal. And so I believe that when we come under the cleansing blood of Christ, that we start walking out our eternity. And so when we do that, we have to live, and we live with this look, with that view of the eternal, not just the temporal. And so we're going to pick back up, and we're going to be in verse 1 of chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. And if you go to Psalm 7, that word is in the beginning of Psalm 7. Most people have no idea what that means. And most scholars will say that it's either the type of psalm or the manner in which the psalm is performed. Because we remember that psalms are psalms. And indeed, this one ends with to be performed with string instrument. So, we'll pick up in verse 2. Lord, I have heard the report about you. Lord, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. And so a prayer of God in the Old Testament is often a little different than our prayer today. A prayer in the Old Testament would often consist and be based on the covenant of God. Habakkuk knew the works of God. We talked about this before, that any Jewish child growing up would have went to synagogue and would be expected to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. He had heard the story about how God had set them apart, starting with Abraham, and then had pulled them out of Egypt, then helped them conquer the land and set kings in place. He knew the works of God, and he wants God to continue to move. In your wrath, remember mercy. Today, in the New Testament, our prayers are a little different because they're based on the relationship that we have with God. No longer are we saved as Christians by the church, right? Christ didn't make a covenant with the church. Christ made a covenant with all who would come to him. It's a little bit different there. Verse 3, God comes from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His brilliance is like light. Rays are flashing from his hand. This is where his power is hidden. Most translations, I think, put horns are in his hand. And horns are symbolic in prophecy of power. The rest of this prophecy we're going to see pieces of the works of God in the Old Testament. And then I believe it starts to pivot and goes to the final work of God, which is the return of Christ. So I'm going to read through verse 15. Plague goes before him, and pestilence follows in his steps. He stands and shakes the earth. He looks and startles the nations. The age-old mountains break apart. The ancient hills sink down. His pathways are ancient. I see the tents of Cushan in distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian tremble. Are you angry at the rivers, Lord? Is your wrath against the rivers? Or is your rage against the sea when you ride on your horses, your victorious chariot? You took the sheath from your bow. The arrows are ready to be used with an oath. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains see you and shudder. A downpour of water sweeps by. The deep roars with its voice and lifts its waves high. Sun and moon stand still in their lofty residence at the flash of your flying arrows, at the brightness of your shining spear. You march across the earth with indignation. You trample down the nations in wrath. You come out to save your people, to save your anointed. You crush the leader of the house of the wicked and strip him from foot to neck. You pierce his head with his own spears. His warriors storm out to scatter us, gloating as if ready to secretly devour the weak. You tread the sea with your horses, stirring up the great waters. Now the symbolism in that passage is extreme, is it not? Now, the thing is let's just make sense of it really quick. Because there's a simple message in there for us today that we have to take from it. And that is going to be that the justice of God is total. The justice of God is complete. We should hear this today. When God steps down to trample the nations, the mountains cannot stand up to him. If God comes down and the mountains fall, what chance have we? The reason I bring this up, the reason I think this is really important today, because we tend to make light of this. That there is a coming, and just as Habakkuk is looking toward the end, right? He's looking into eternity, I believe, in this prophecy, and in his dialogue with God and his faith. But there's justice. Initially, there'll be justice against Judah, then there'll be justice against Babylon, and then against the Greeks, and then the Romans, right, and the Persians. All these countries, everything is going to rise and fall. And there will be justice, and we lose sight of the fact that God is the one who brings that justice about. every punishment will be exacted, every mark fulfilled. Think about this. Have you ever talked to somebody? I know I'm not the only one that works and sometimes, lives around and stuff with people that aren't saved, right? And you ever heard somebody tell you, well, I've got to deal with God. Me and God have an understanding. In light of this passage, what do you think that means? If God shows up and the mountains fall down, what do you think their understanding or their deal is going to look like? I'll read verse 16 real quick. I heard, and I trembled within. My lips quivered at the sound. Rottenness entered my bones. I trembled where I stood. Now I must quietly wait for the day of distress to come against the people invading us. Now, Habakkuk has a response of faith looking past everything, right? But in the beginning of that verse, we're shown that nobody's deal is going to stand. Nobody's agreement is going to be held when the mountains fall. This is important because even if you look at progressive Christianity, right? Progressive Christianity, which has been, I've heard it described very well as a tidal wave that is swamping the church of Jesus Christ. And they'll dig into the epistles, right? The epistles of John. They'll go to the New Testament, the epistles of John, and they'll find that verse that says God is love. And they'll take those three words and they pull them out of the context. They'll pull them out of the book. They'll pull them out of the covenant. And they just cover everything with God is love. God is love. And God truly is. The book of Habakkuk is bookended in chapter 1 and in chapter 3. That God saves in chapter 1 and chapter 3. He is the God of our salvation. God does love. A God that saves you loves you. But God is also holy. And God is also just. If you're banking on simply the love of God while trying to escape the justice of God, you are in for a world of pain. The reason I say this, the reason I think this is important, is because what does the church do about this? Think about the one person you have. I know everybody has this one person in their life, right? They have this one person that they love dearly. You love them. They're not saved, but they're a great person. They're really good. I mean, they're thoughtless, in the sense of our human, our secular minds, right? They're nice. They always try and help out. They do good things. They don't hurt anybody, but they're not saved. Now you think about that person, and you think about the fact that they're going to have to stand before God and give an account. Think about that. Because every single person that has ever lived will have to give an account before God. Right? And of course, the judgment of believers is separate from the judgment of the world, right? And because we go to the judging of believers, because the judgment for believers was already done at the cross. There's a separate judgment for unbelievers in which all the books are open. We had it in our call to worship this morning. The books are open, including the book of life, and their name is not found in it. And this should be a call to the church to be serious, because the mission that we are given from Christ has eternal consequences and is deathly serious. Deathly serious. It's not about being a good person. It's not about doing good things necessarily, but it is about Christ. Because justice is coming. I believe we live closer to the end than to the beginning, right? Of the first coming. We're about 2,000 years-ish from the first coming. I believe we're closer to the second one than we are the first. And that means we need to be, as saints and as a church, we have to be serious about this. Because this is deathly serious. And also, just as a side note, in this passage, we see that God metes out the justice upon the whole earth. The one that metes out justice is the judge. What is the church not? The judge. The church has gotten this really wrong through church history, where the church has meted out, even up to the point of executions. It's not for us to pass judgment. That is God's. We're called as a church to have judgment. I believe we're taught, especially in God's Word, right from wrong and what He calls us to and what He doesn't. We have to have judgment. But we, just as Christ came to each one of us in our sin, in love, do we not love the world in that same way? We don't have to condone them. We don't have to encourage them. But we can love them. And love them enough to tell them what is coming. There is coming a time of justice. Verse 17. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will triumph in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Verse 17, let's put this in real world context, right? So we understand it. When the grocery stores are empty and the gas stations are boarded up, when we have no transportation and there's nothing we can do, I will triumph in Yahweh. Triumph not by ourselves, not by our works, but by Yahweh, God, the God of our salvation. Yahweh, my Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like those of a deer and enables me to walk on mountain heights. So we know that the God who saves is the God of our salvation, the God that causes us, in the words of Habakkuk, to triumph even when everything else falls apart. And I was when I prayed into this and I studied it and studied it, now there's three things I think that keep us from being able to triumph in Yahweh. There's three things as we look at the overarching, the thing is to keep, not to ignore the temporal, but to look beyond the temporal earthly things in our life and look into the eternal, which is where our true home is. The first W, there's three W's. I probably don't say that. There's three W's. The first W is the what. What happened? Or what's happening, right? And what's happening can cause a lot of people to stumble or a lot of people to fall away. And that what is variable. A lot of people have a lot of different what. You want an example of a what? There was a what last year that caused a lot of people to quit coming to church. And I'll tell you why I call that a what today, because there's a lot of people that when that what happened, they never came back. We were closed for a couple months and we reopened, but there were a lot of people that left before when that what, and they've never come back. And I'll tell you statistically, looking at statistics, that those people that walked away from church, they disengaged from the Bible, they disengaged from prayer, they disengaged from worship. So what? We can't let the what override everything, can we? The second W is the where. Now we know in Scripture, right? We know that God is sovereign. We can't lose sight of God is sovereign. And we know that God called Abraham out from his people, right? God met Moses on the side of a mountain. God called the Israelites out. Now granted, they were only supposed to be in the wilderness for like 11 days and it turned into 40 years, right? But the fact is that God, when we walk with God, when we make the decision to walk with Him through Christ, we will be taken places. We will be taken to wheres, right? And sometimes the wheres suck. Sometimes the wheres and the whats, even the whats and the wheres both can grind your soul. The pain, the grief of the what and the wheres can take what it feels like everything from you. They can. If you accuse me sometimes of glossing over the whats and the wheres that happen in our lives and looking to the eternity, You would be right. I'm guilty of that sometimes because I try to keep the focus on forever and not today. Because today is not forever. The what, whatever the what is in your life, or whatever the what is that you have going on is not forever. The where you are is not forever. This is you know, you remember Habakkuk is saying this. Look at verse 17 again. All these things are going to fail. The life that he knows it is going to end, right? And chances are this thing, you know, Habakkuk is not going to live through the exile, right? It's not going to, the what and the where for him in this earthly temporal sense is not going to get better. Yet I will triumph in Yahweh. And that's, and so we have to, I mean, I promise, I swear to you, you know, we can grieve, we can mourn, we can struggle, and we can cry and be sad and be mad in the what and in the where. But as we are in the what, as we are in the where, we have to continually, just as Habakkuk does, just as Christ did, we have to have that look where we're looking through the what, we're looking through the where, into what is to come. And that is the fullness of God. The horns in his hand, his glory hidden in his hand is not always going to be hidden in his hand. There will be a time of the fullness of the glory of God. A time when he steps on the earth and the mountains fall flat. Think about that. And if your name is written in the book of life, and you have nothing to fear on that day, when the ultimate what happens, and we get taken to the ultimate where, instead of being afraid, instead of having anxiety, instead of having pain, simply joy and peace that are completely ununderstandable. The last W is who. And when I say who, I'm talking about you. I'm talking about me. Who we are at any one point can make us stumble. Right? This is something that we have to understand, that when we come into a church, any church, you go into any church right now, and you walk in, and there are going to be people that are all at a different point in their walk with God. And there will also be people sitting in the church that may not even be on a walk with God. So any churches is going to happen. There'll be people that are you know, close to God. There'll be people that are kind of on the path. There'll be people at the fork, and there'll be people that they're still in the parking lot. Truly. And we can't get so hung up on who we are at any one time, because what's more important, who we say we are or who God says we are? Who has the power to change us into who God says we are? God. I'll throw this little nugget out, but the chances are that if humanity could fix itself and all of its problems, it would have done it by now. Instead, we have TikTok. Come, Lord Jesus, come. But truly, all right. He makes my feet like those of a deer and enables me to walk on mountain heights. He makes my feet like those of a deer. This doesn't sound like our effort. He makes my feet. And like we triumph in Yahweh, he makes my feet like those of a deer. I don't know much about deer. Right? I was a deer hunter for a couple of years until I figured out that I was bad at it and I quit. Now, one thing that I'm good at, though, right? One thing I'm good at is scaring deer in the woods. I know why they call them white-tailed deer here. Because when I spook them and they run away from me, I see the little white tuft on the back of their tail, right? So I understand this. But one thing I'll tell you that I learned from watching deer run away from me while I have a gun is that they are very sure-footed. They are very good at getting where they need to go, right? Deer are known for that. I know the King James says hinds feet, right? So because all those animals are very sure-footed. And so he makes my feet like deer's feet. Who makes our path secure? God. We don't have to do it. He does it. He makes us sure-footed, able to tread on the mountain heights. I know some Bible translations say our mountain pass or my mountain pass, right? And that's the point that as we triumph in God, we look past the what, we look past the where, and we look past, I dare say, even the who, right? Because who I am today is not who I am forever, right? Job, in the middle of his suffering, said, my Redeemer liveth, and I shall in my flesh see God. This isn't forever. Tomorrow's not forever. Forever is forever. And as we triumph in God, we look past the what, we look past the where, we look past the who into eternity. Our feet are made sure to be on the path that God has set for us. Now, I'll tell you something about hiking. I do know about hiking, right? I love to hike. You know, I love going to Spring Mill. It's up in Mitchell. And I'll tell you something. You go to Spring Mill in the summer, it's packed. Popular, super popular place to go. Super popular place to hike. And you go down by Pioneer Village. I like to start there because they have concessions. And you start at the trail there, right? And you'll be on the trailhead, and it's shoulder to shoulder. Seriously, you'll be on that trail, and you're just like walking like this with a bunch of. You go about 3 or 4 miles in, you're by yourself. And so if we're set, if we have our feet made like deer's feet and set upon the mountain paths,